Eric Caldwell had always believed that marriage was about loyalty, sacrifice, and standing by each other through the darkest of times. That belief was put to the test when his younger sister, Hannah, was diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. From the moment he got the call, Eric knew where he needed to be. Hannah had no one else, no husband, no children, and their parents had passed years ago. He was her only family, and he wouldn't let her fight alone. His wife, Melissa, had been understanding at first. "You have to be there for her, Eric," she had said, holding his hands. "I'll be fine. Just take care of Hannah." Those words felt like a promise, a vow that while he was helping his sister fight for her life, Melissa would be waiting for him. What Eric didn't know was that, while he was staying by Hannah's bedside in a sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital, his wife was making promises of a different kind to another man. Eric spent weeks traveling back and forth between their home and the hospital 2 states away. The treatments were brutal, and Hannah was fragile, her body barely holding up against the onslaught of chemotherapy. In the beginning, Melissa called and texted often. "Melissa, how's Hannah today?" "Eric, still fighting. It's hard to see her like this." "Melissa, I can only imagine. I miss you." But as the weeks dragged on, the messages grew shorter. Calls became less frequent. Whenever Eric tried to have a real conversation, Melissa seemed distracted, distant. "Eric, is everything okay?" Melissa, "Yeah, just work stress. And the house stuff. Nothing major." The house. That was another thing weighing on Eric's mind. Before Hannah got sick, he and Melissa had been searching for a new home. Their real estate agent, Brandon Mitchell, had been helping them for months, showing them listings, arranging open houses. Melissa had taken over the house hunt while Eric was away. "I'll handle it," she had told him. "Just focus on your sister." At the time, he had been grateful. Now, something about it didn't sit right. 2 months into Hannah's treatment, she took a turn for the worse. The doctors had to move quickly with an emergency procedure, and Eric knew he couldn't leave. He called Melissa that evening. "I'm staying another week," he told her. "Hannah needs me." There was a pause before she answered. "Oh, okay." Eric frowned. "You don't sound happy about that." No, it's just, I thought maybe you'd be back this weekend," Melissa said. "I miss you." "I miss you too," Eric said, rubbing his tired eyes. "But I can't leave her, Mel. Not now." Melissa sighed. "I get it. I'll see you when you get home." It wasn't until later that Eric realized what was so strange about that call. She hadn't said "I love you." Eric finally returned home after 6 grueling weeks. Hannah was stable, but the doctors made it clear the road ahead would be long. Still, Eric was relieved to be back in his own bed, back in his own life. Melissa greeted him with a warm smile, hugging him tightly. "I missed you so much," she murmured. But something was different. The hug felt forced, and when he kissed her, it felt like kissing a stranger. Trying to shake the feeling, Eric settled back into routine. The next day, he noticed something odd, a men's jacket hanging by the door. A jacket that wasn't his. He frowned. "Hey, Mel, whose jacket is this?" Melissa glanced at it, her expression momentarily freezing before she forced a laugh. "Oh, that's Brandon's. He came over a few times to talk about listings. I must have forgotten to give it back." Something about the way she rushed through the explanation made Eric's stomach twist. "That's weird," he said slowly. "Why was he coming here instead of just calling?" Melissa turned away, busying herself in the kitchen. "He said it was easier to go over paperwork in person." Eric stared at her back, unease creeping up his spine. That night, Eric couldn't sleep. His mind replayed every odd moment, every change in Melissa's behavior. His gut was screaming at him that something was wrong. At 2 a.m., he made a decision. Quietly, he slipped out of bed and picked up Melissa's phone from the nightstand. He hesitated. He had never invaded her privacy before. But something about Brandon's jacket, about her coldness, it all felt wrong. Taking a deep breath, he opened her messages. And there it was. "Brandon, last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you." Melissa, "Me neither. I wish he wasn't coming back so soon." Eric's blood ran cold. His hands trembled as he scrolled further. "Brandon, I love having you all to myself. Melissa, I love it too. Eric set the phone down, staring at the ceiling, his entire world crumbling around him. The next morning, Eric sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, waiting. When Melissa finally walked in, yawning, he placed her phone in front of her. Her face went pale. "What's this?" she asked, though her voice already carried the weight of guilt. "You tell me," Eric said coldly. Melissa swallowed hard, avoiding his gaze. "Eric, Don't," he cut her off. "Don't insult me with lies. I saw the messages." Tears welled in her eyes. "I never meant to hurt you." Eric let out a bitter laugh. "Really? Because that didn't stop you." Melissa broke down, covering her face with her hands. "I was lonely, Eric. You were gone for months. I didn't know how to handle it." Eric's hands clenched into fists. "So while I was sitting in a hospital, watching my sister fight for her life, you were screwing our real estate agent?" Melissa sobbed. "I know I was wrong, but please don't let this destroy us." Eric stared at her, shaking his head. "Melissa, you destroyed us." Eric left the house that day, unable to look at her any longer. He drove aimlessly, anger and heartbreak warring inside him. By the time he returned that evening, he had made up his mind. Melissa was waiting, her face streaked with tears. "Eric, please, I'll do anything. I'll end it with Brandon. We'll go to counseling." Eric shook his head. "There's no coming back from this, Melissa. We're done." She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing, but Eric didn't feel pity. He felt numb. As he walked away, he realized that the woman he had once loved, the woman he had trusted with his heart, was nothing more than a stranger now. And there was no fixing that. Eric spent the next few days in a haze of disbelief and rage. His mind refused to accept the reality of what Melissa had done. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her messages, her words meant for another man. While he had been holding Hannah's hand through her pain, Melissa had been in someone else's arms. That thought made his stomach churn. But he wasn't done yet. There was one more person who needed to answer for this. Eric didn't tell Melissa where he was going. He didn't need her permission for what came next. Brandon Mitchell's office was a sleek, modern space in the city. Eric stormed in without an appointment, ignoring the receptionist's protests. Brandon was sitting at his desk, scrolling through his computer. When he looked up and saw Eric, his face went white. "Eric," he said, standing quickly. Before he could finish, Eric grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the wall. "You were supposed to help us find a house," Eric hissed, his grip tightening. Like the video in support of Eric, the office fell silent. Other employees stopped what they were doing, staring wide-eyed at the scene unfolding before them. Brandon swallowed hard. "Eric, I didn't mean for this to happen." Eric's fist clenched. It took everything in him not to punch the man right then and there. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" Eric echoed, his voice dangerously low. "You think I give a damn about your excuses?" Brandon's eyes darted around, looking for an escape. "Look, man, I know I screwed up, but it wasn't just me. Melissa, she wanted this too." Eric released him with a shove, disgusted. "You're a pathetic excuse for a man." Brandon adjusted his collar, trying to act composed. "I get that you're angry, but—" Eric didn't wait to hear the rest. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving Brandon standing there, humiliated and exposed. When Eric got home, Melissa was waiting for him. She had been crying, her eyes red and swollen. "Where were you?" she asked softly. Eric set his keys on the table, staring at her coldly, tying up loose ends. She flinched at the iciness in his voice. "Eric, please. I don't want to lose you." Eric laughed bitterly. "You lost me the second you let him touch you." Melissa wiped at her tears. "I'll do anything. I'll cut him out of my life." Don't bother," Eric interrupted. "We're done, Melissa. There's no fixing this." She sobbed. "I love you." Eric's expression hardened. "You don't even know what love is." The hardest part of all was explaining things to their 6-year-old daughter, Emma. Melissa begged him not to tell her the truth. "She's too young to understand," she argued. Eric had agreed not to tell her the details, but he wouldn't lie either. A few nights later, as Eric tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at him with big, innocent eyes. "Daddy, why is Mommy so sad all the time?" Eric's chest ached. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Mommy and Daddy are having some grown-up problems, sweetheart. But no matter what happens, we both love you very much." Emma frowned. "You're not going to leave me, right?" Eric kissed her forehead. "Never." Emma smiled sleepily. "Okay. Love you, Daddy." As Eric sat in the dark after she fell asleep, he realized that Emma was the only good thing left in his marriage. The divorce process started soon after. Eric refused to drag it out. Melissa, on the other hand, still clung to hope. "Are you sure about this?" she asked one evening as they sat across from each other at the dining table. Eric stared at her, his voice devoid of emotion. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Melissa broke down crying, but Eric didn't comfort her. He was done. There was no coming back from this. The weeks after Eric filed for divorce were a whirlwind of tension, anger, and cold, suffocating silence. The once warm home he had built with Melissa felt more like a prison now. Every conversation was a battlefield, every shared space a reminder of what had been lost. Melissa, despite everything, refused to accept that this was the end. "I know I messed up, Eric," she said one night, standing in the kitchen as he packed a bag to stay at a hotel. "But don't we deserve a second chance? For Emma's sake?" Eric zipped up his bag without looking at her. "You weren't thinking about Emma when you were sneaking around with Brandon." She flinched but pressed on. "I was lonely, Eric. You were gone for weeks. You just left." Eric turned to face her, his patience snapping. "I didn't just leave, Melissa. My sister was dying. And instead of standing by me, you were standing in someone else's arms." Tears streamed down her face. "I hate myself for what I did, but I love you. Doesn't that count for something?" Eric stared at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "Not anymore." With that, he slung his bag over his shoulder and walked out. It wasn't long before the truth leaked out. Their families, friends, and even neighbors began whispering about what had happened. Eric's best friend, Caleb, was the first to confront him about it. "I heard about Melissa," Caleb said, slamming his beer on the bar counter. "Dude, I swear, if you don't kill that bastard Brandon, I will." Eric sighed, rubbing his temples. "He's not worth it." Caleb scoffed. "You're a better man than me. If my wife did that while I was taking care of my sister, I'd burn the whole damn house down." Eric let out a humorless chuckle. "Trust me, I've thought about it." Meanwhile, Melissa was facing her own backlash. Friends who once adored her now avoided her. Her sister, Emily, was furious. "How could you do this to Eric?" Emily hissed over the phone. "He was taking care of Hannah, and you, God, Melissa. I don't even recognize you." Melissa sobbed into the phone, but Emily had no sympathy. "Eric deserved better," Emily said before hanging up, and Melissa knew she was right. Though Eric refused to fight in front of Emma, the tension between him and Melissa was impossible to hide. The little girl wasn't oblivious to the cold glances, the late-night arguments behind closed doors. One afternoon, as Eric helped Emma with her school project, she hesitated before asking, "Daddy, are you mad at Mommy?" Eric froze, his heart breaking. He set down the glue stick and looked her in the eyes. "I'm not mad at you, sweetheart," he said carefully. "Mommy and we're not getting along right now." Emma frowned. "Are you going to live here forever?" Eric sighed. "I don't know, baby. But no matter where I am, I'll always be your dad." That seemed to satisfy her, but deep down, Eric knew that this was only the beginning of the damage Melissa had caused. As the divorce proceedings moved forward, Melissa's life became lonelier and lonelier. Her friends had distanced themselves. Her family barely spoke to her. And Brandon? He had moved on. She called him one evening, desperate for comfort. "Brandon, I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice shaking. There was a long pause before he answered. "Melissa, I think we should stop talking." Melissa's heart dropped. "What? But you said—" "I know what I said," Brandon interrupted. "But this whole thing, it's gotten messy. I need to focus on my career." Melissa let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, so now I'm a liability?" Brandon sighed. "I'm sorry, Melissa, but I think it's best if we go our separate ways." The line went dead. Melissa stared at the phone in disbelief. She had destroyed her marriage for him, and now he was walking away without a second thought. She had lost everything. The night before their divorce was finalized, Melissa showed up at Eric's temporary apartment. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice small. Eric let her in, but kept his arms crossed. "What is it?" She hesitated before whispering, "I regret everything." Eric sighed. "Melissa, it's too late." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't expect you to take me back. I just need you to know that if I could go back and change it, I would. I was selfish. I was weak. And I lost the best thing that ever happened to me." Eric studied her for a long moment. Finally, he said, "I believe you." Hope flickered in her eyes, but it disappeared with his next words. "But it doesn't change anything." Melissa let out a broken sob, nodding. "I know." And that was the last real conversation they ever had. The morning of the final divorce hearing arrived, bringing with it an overwhelming sense of finality. Eric stood outside the courthouse, staring at the heavy doors that would officially end his marriage. Melissa arrived a few minutes later, looking tired and defeated. Her once bright eyes were dull, her usual confident posture slumped. She had lost weight, and her clothes hung loosely on her frame. For a brief moment, Eric felt a pang of pity, but then he remembered the texts, the betrayal, the way she had chosen Brandon over him when he had been fighting for his sister's life. Pity wasn't enough to undo what she had done. "Are you ready for this?" Melissa asked quietly. Eric exhaled sharply. "I've been ready since the moment I found out." She flinched at his words but didn't argue. Without another word, they walked into the courthouse, side by side but worlds apart. The proceedings were quick and emotionless. Melissa had no grounds to fight for anything significant. Eric's lawyer had made sure of that. She got to keep the house, but Eric got primary custody of Emma. Melissa would have visitation rights, but she knew deep down that her daughter was slipping away from her. Eric signed the last document with a steady hand. When he looked up, he caught Melissa staring at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. She signed her name with a shaky hand. And just like that, it was over. Eric didn't wait around. He walked out of the courthouse without looking back. Melissa sat at the table long after the judge had dismissed them, staring blankly at the papers that now legally defined her as alone. The first few weeks after the divorce were the hardest for Melissa. When she picked up Emma for her weekend visits, the little girl was polite but distant. She no longer ran into her mother's arms with the same enthusiasm she once had. One evening, as Melissa was tucking Emma into bed at her new apartment, she whispered, "Do you like coming here?" Emma hesitated before shrugging. "It's okay." Melissa swallowed hard. "You can tell me the truth, sweetheart." Emma looked away. "I just miss Daddy." Tears stung Melissa's eyes. "I know, baby. But Mommy loves you so much." Emma nodded, but didn't say anything else. Melissa turned off the lights and left the room, collapsing onto the couch in silent sobs. She had lost her husband, and now she was losing her daughter, too. Melissa hadn't heard from Brandon since he had coldly ended things over the phone. But one night, she found herself dialing his number anyway. He answered after a few rings. "Melissa?" She hesitated, gripping the phone tightly. I wanted to talk." Brandon sighed. "Melissa, we shouldn't do this." She let out a bitter laugh. "You were all over me when it was a secret. But now that I'm alone, you want nothing to do with me?" Brandon was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I never wanted this to get so serious. I didn't think you'd actually leave, Eric." Melissa's breath caught in her throat. "Are you saying I wasn't worth it?" Brandon sighed again. "I'm saying it was fun while it lasted. But we both know this was a mistake." Tears filled Melissa's eyes. "So what? I was just some game to you?" "I'm sorry," Brandon said, but there was no real emotion in his voice. "Take care of yourself, Melissa." The call ended. Melissa threw the phone across the room. While Melissa spiraled, Eric was moving forward. His nights were no longer sleepless. The weight in his chest was lighter. He had been spending more time with Emma, rebuilding their life without Melissa. One evening, his friend Caleb invited him to a small gathering. "You need to get out of that apartment, man," Caleb insisted. Eric hesitated, but eventually agreed. That night, he met a woman named Lauren. She was kind, easy to talk to, and most importantly, she wasn't Melissa. They exchanged numbers, and for the first time in a long time, Eric felt something close to hope. Months passed, and Melissa's world continued to shrink. Her friends had moved on. The people who once admired her turned their backs. Her own family still spoke to her, but the warmth was gone. One evening, she saw Eric at the grocery store with Lauren. Melissa felt like she had been punched in the gut. Lauren was laughing at something Eric had said, and worst of all, Eric was smiling. Melissa turned and walked out of the store before they could see her. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, realizing that Eric had done what she couldn't. He had moved on, and she was still stuck in the ruins of her own choices. A year after the divorce, Melissa asked Eric if they could talk. They met at a park, sitting on opposite sides of a wooden bench. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," Melissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." Eric nodded but didn't say anything. Melissa looked down at her hands. "I see you with her. The new girl?" "Her name's Lauren," Eric said simply. Melissa swallowed hard. "You look happy." Eric finally turned to face her. "I am." Tears welled up in Melissa's eyes, but she forced a small smile. "I'm glad." They sat in silence for a few moments before Melissa whispered, "Do you ever miss me?" Eric exhaled slowly. "I miss who I thought you were." Melissa broke down. Eric stood up. "Goodbye, Melissa." And with that, he walked away for the last time. Melissa sat on the bench, watching him disappear into the distance, knowing she had destroyed the best thing she ever had. And this time, there were no second chances. Eric rebuilt his life. He and Lauren grew closer, and Emma thrived in a loving, stable home. Melissa never truly recovered. She lived in the shadow of her mistakes, her life forever haunted by what she had thrown away. Brandon? He was nothing more than a footnote, a meaningless mistake in a long list of regrets. Some betrayals can never be undone, and some mistakes leave people broken beyond repair. Melissa learned that the hard way. Thank you for listening to the story to the end. Please like, share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel.